This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to this webinar by the IIEA on the key outcomes of the COP that just took place in Belém in Brazil. I'm Fergal McNamara, and I'm moderating the section this afternoon, and I'm co-chair of the Climate and Energy Group here at the Institute. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Simon Evans of policy of Carbon Brief. Simon is a senior policy editor there, and I will introduce him properly momentarily. But just a few housekeeping matters to start us off. I'm going to have a conversation with Simon about the outcome of COP for about 35 minutes. And afterwards, it's your chance to join the conversation. And please do so by putting your questions as they occur to you. Don't wait. Into the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. This session is on the record, and for those of you who are inclined to use social media, please tag us using the hashtag @IIEA. And Simon, you're very welcome here to the Institute. You're a deputy editor and senior policy editor and a multi-award winning energy journalist with Carbon Brief. You have a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Bristol, and you studied chemistry at Oxford. And Carbon Brief itself is an outlet covering climate science, climate policy, and energy policy. And Simon, you're very welcome to the IIA this afternoon, and very welcome virtually to Ireland.
Many thanks, Fergal. Yeah, great to be with you.
Simon, I suppose you could start this off by just talking about the atmosphere and the facilities around this particular COP. You know, you or your colleagues, many of your colleagues were out there covering it, sending us back high quality journalism every day on the WhatsApp. Really appreciated that, and the report that was available on your website afterwards was very good. But please tell us a little bit about the facilities, the atmosphere, the city, the accommodation. What was it like? What were the creature comforts like? How was it all set up and organized?
Yeah, so this is sort of an interesting one for me personally because for reasons that I will come on to, I didn't go myself. So as you mentioned, I had several colleagues out in Brazil covering it live in person. And I had this slightly surreal experience of sitting in the office you can see me in now, trying to keep track of what was going on, not quite halfway around the world. And actually, the reason that I didn't go, I've been to pretty much every COP since Paris in 2015. And the reason I didn't go this year was because, your listeners may well have heard about this. There was a lot of media reporting about whether or not Belém was going to be sufficiently well set up to host, 40, 50, 60,000 people attending COP30. And it's a relatively small city from what I understand, like maybe 2 or 3 million people. And in terms of infrastructure facilities, even down to basics like, kind of water, roads, broadband and so on. I think there were significant concerns through a lot of this year as to whether it would be, whether it would be able to cope with hosting an event of this size and scale. And one of the manifestations of that was that there simply aren't that many hotels in Belém. And so for a long part of this year, we were not sure as Carbon Brief whether we would be sending anyone, let alone whether I myself would be going, which would have been totally unprecedented. Since I can't remember a COP that none of us went to certainly since I've been at Carbon Brief, which is 11 years. Then finally, I think it was maybe August or something. It was quite late in the year. They suddenly opened their official accommodation portal. And as it had been widely reported, the accommodation prices were incredibly high. And so, the long and short of it is that our accommodation budget only stretched to 3 people. And we just decided tactically that I wouldn't go, that I would watch live stream, stay in touch with people on, WhatsApp and so on, keep track of the texts, negotiating texts as they came out. So I wasn't there, but what I can tell you from speaking to colleagues and from, even just from watching some of the live streams is that, it was quite an intensely visceral experience from what I've heard. It was very humid, well over 30 degrees, close to 100% humidity a lot of the time. There were very regular, very heavy rainstorms throughout. I think at times people were really struggling to hear during events, during negotiations or side events, simply because it was all taking place in a kind of a temporary structure, and there was this intense rainfall hammering down. On top of which, I think it was air conditioned within the venue, but the fans for the air conditioning were incredibly loud. So you have this kind of being at the COP's always a little bit of a physical ordeal in a way that's quite hard to describe if you haven't been in person. But I think this year was particularly visceral and particularly tough physically for those that were attending. I guess one other thing, I think we were quite lucky. Our accommodation that we found was an apartment, and it was very close to the venue. My colleague said that it felt safe to walk around, and there was reasonable food outside the venue. The food in the venue, as is often the case, was pretty terrible, particularly for vegetarians. But outside the venue, I think they enjoyed the city of Belém. There was a very, very heavy police presence for a lot of the time. So I think whereas if you look up Belém, you'll find lots of articles telling you that lots of parts of the city aren't very safe. But I think they kind of put a lid on that with lots and lots of police on the ground. But yeah, I could speak for longer, but maybe I should leave it there and we can move on.
Okay, very, very good. Of course, Belém was very symbolic to being in the location that it was at the sort of mouth of the Amazon, and
Absolutely, yeah.
the topic of tropical forests was live. Maybe we get on to sort of more substantive things. Can you speak a little bit about the expectations at the outset for this COP, and sort of where things got left off? Like we had the UAE consensus about tripling renewables last year at Baku. A very big topic was on finance. The United States were declining to join, and could you speak a little bit really about what was formally on the agenda, but what was in the atmosphere around that people had expected to sort of achieve going into the COP?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you rightly divide things between the kind of broader expectations versus what was formally on the agenda, and that. In fact, that kind of split between the formal and the informal definitely kind of created some challenges for the Brazilians managing the process as the COP presidency. In terms of what was formally on the agenda, like the really big thing that was supposed to be agreed, and indeed was ultimately agreed in Belém, was a set of indicators for what's called the Global Goal on Adaptation. So within the Paris Agreement, I'm going to guess, I think it's Article 7. I might be getting this wrong. But anyway, one of the articles of the Paris Agreement is about setting a global goal on adaptation. Obviously, people will be familiar with the temperature goal of Paris, which is well below 2 and efforts towards 1.5. But people don't necessarily realise that there's also a global goal on adaptation. The reason people don't realise is because it's quite loose and ill-defined. And so 10 years on from Paris, we're only now getting to the point of trying to make it more concrete, more measurable. So I think it was possibly also in Dubai, I forget exactly the details, but they agreed a so-called framework for the global goal on adaptation, where they effectively, the goal is like very loose about increasing adaptive capacity and blah, blah, blah. It's quite hard, it's a set of words that you couldn't really measure. And it's not even really clear what the targets would look like. So they set out a kind of a framework of targets for that global goal a couple of years ago, but there still wasn't a way to actually measure that. Obviously with an with a temperature target, you've got lots of science around if you want to stay below 2 degrees, then you need to do this to emissions. And we obviously report emissions every year, and we can track progress quite easily. It's all quite straightforward. And of course, a ton of emissions in China is equal to a ton of emissions in the UK or indeed in Ireland in terms of the impact on global temperatures. So it's kind of comparable across geographies and around the world. Whereas for adaptation, boosting adaptive capacity is very context specific. We've got heavy rainfall this afternoon in London. The context there is very different to, say, in Belém or in Dublin or in Shanghai. And so so there was a set of indicators that they were trying to agree that would actually finally be sort of measurable in terms of progress on that global goal and adaptation. So that was one of the big things on the agenda. Another thing that was I think for the first time on the COP agenda was the question of kind of reforming the process of the COP itself. It's something that is kind of quite cryptically described as arrangements for intergovernmental meetings. And it's normally something that's only discussed at the sort of half-yearly intersessional meetings that are held in Bonn every June. But because there's been this kind of sense that the COP process is maybe not working as well as it could or as efficiently as it might, there's been this sort of increasing clamour for reform of the COP process. And so the Brazilian presidency kind of put that into the agenda for this COP. So that was quite a big expectation going into the summit, although it fell rather flat in the event. And then sort of zooming out a little bit in terms of the kind of wider expectations. You mentioned the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement, obviously for the second time under President Trump. We've got this very kind of challenging geopolitical environment and a sense that multilateralism in general and collective climate action specifically is kind of under threat. And so that was a real backdrop, and there was a real sense that COP30 needed to somehow respond to that, to show that multilateralism still had a place, that there was still, even if it was only 197 countries out of 198, that the vast majority of countries were still committed to climate action. And one last thing that I should mention that was an important part of the backdrop for COP30 was under the Paris Agreement. Obviously, it's coming up, I think, in a week to the 10th anniversary of that being agreed in Paris back in 2015. And one part of that agreement is that obviously countries make their climate pledges, then so-called nationally determined contributions towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement on emissions, on adaptation, and so on. And those pledges get renewed every 5 years. And there's also a sort of a 5-yearly cycle of taking stock, collectively looking at how we're doing and deciding if we're on track or not. And that stock take process concluded in Dubai 2 years ago at COP28 and showed, as was obviously already widely understood, that we were way off track. And particularly when it comes to mitigation and staying below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And so this year there was meant to be a new set of climate pledges from all countries, increasing their ambition and hopefully starting to bridge that gap towards the temperature target. A lot of countries coming into the COP hadn't submitted new pledges, or you have like the EU, for example, had submitted a kind of a headline number, but not the actual pledge itself. Likewise, China had done that. But through the course of the 2 weeks, I think we got up to about 120 countries submitting new pledges. And collectively that the UN climate body said that they collectively mean global emissions peaking and starting to decline by 2035, which is the first time they've been able to say that. So progress in some sense, but obviously far from sufficient to stay below 1.5. So it was quite a lot of things going on coming into the COP, and then we'll probably come on to in a minute. Lots of that manifested in lots of different ways during the COP itself.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to talk about that, because I think there was a lot of worrying about a repeat of the experience that happened in the IMO in relation to the US absence in COP, and maybe that might the shadow of that might reach into the proceedings at Belém. I don't think that materialized. And so there were two other things that maybe you didn't mention going in was the tropical the tropical forest forever facility, uh,
Hmm.
championed by the Brazilian presidency. And also the unilateral trade measures, particularly the European CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Those features much in the atmosphere going in.
So, I mean, taking those in turn, like the TFFF, this forest fund. So this is something that is actually been discussed and put around as an idea for many years. Um, yeah, we published an article ahead of the COP looking into the idea, where it came from, what it's supposed to achieve, and so on. And effectively, the idea is that you get a bunch of rich donors, whether that's countries or philanthropies or development banks or whatever, to put in 25 billion as a kind of a seed fund, and then you use that money to de-risk investment from the private sector. With the target that Brazil's put about is an additional 100 billion of investment from the private sector, and then you've got this 125 billion pounds investment fund effectively, and then you use the returns on the investment to pay countries to keep forests standing. That's at the heart of it. That's the idea. And of course, we've had, for many years, different initiatives, and ideas about how to slow and halt deforestation. Lots of pledges, thinking back to COP26 in Glasgow a few years ago, there was a global pledge that many countries signed up to halt deforestation by 2030. But there hasn't really been a kind of a mechanism to actually make that happen, right? To provide the funds to actually make it pay to make it pay to keep the trees standing rather than cutting them down. So that's kind of the concept. I mean, going into the summit, quite a limited amount had been pledged into the TFFF. I think I can't remember exactly the total. I think maybe another 5.5 billion was pledged during the COP. But to be honest, I feel like there was a lot of talk of this idea before the COP and not so much during it. And then taking the other thing that you mentioned, the US and the IMO. So for listeners that aren't aware, that the International Maritime Organization, it's like the UN body for global shipping. In April, they had agreed, they'd voted and had agreed a draft plan for cutting shipping emissions, which involved a global carbon tax, and it would have been the first sector in the world to have a kind of a uniform carbon tax on all shipping across all countries. And it was supposed to be rubber stamped in I think it was September or October. And effectively what happened is that the Trump administration got wind of what was happening. And of course, they're only one vote, but they bullied and shook down, in quite kind of extreme fashion, lots of countries, and made threats against individual diplomats personally, and said you won't be able to get a visa to the US. And then they said, we'll introduce charges on your ships if you vote for this, blah blah blah. So ultimately, they were able to undermine, scuttle that shipping deal. And there was a lot of worry that they might try similar tactics around the COP. But in fact, I mean, there was some speculation as to what role, if any, the US might have been playing behind the scenes. But I had to be honest, I think I had one conversation, I can't even remember what it was about now, where someone mentioned the US throughout the COP. And effectively, no, they were completely absent. They didn't send a delegation at all. And as to my knowledge, they weren't actively kind of working behind the scenes to undermine the outcome in the way that they had done with the IMO.
And it must have been a lonely place for the EU without the US for the first time ever, and also the EU, these unilateral trade measures and the CBAM question, the EU coming under some pressure in relation to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to address that, but yeah, so it's interesting. This is something it's been in the air around the COP for a few years now, and a group of countries, it's the so-called like-minded developing countries, which is a group, I think, about 25 countries. Most prominently, members include China, India, Saudi Arabia, and others, and they've been pushing a wish to talk about what unilateral trade measures. What I hadn't actually appreciated is that this is something that's mentioned explicitly in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is obviously back, goes back way back to 1992. And there's language in there basically saying that climate policies and unilateral trade measures resulting from them shouldn't be a means of arbitrary discrimination. Um, and so, yeah, obviously, those countries for a few years now have been trying to resurrect this as an issue, and they want to bring it back into the formal agenda at the COP. And in previous COPs, the last couple, I think at least, they've attempted and been unsuccessful in bringing that into the COP's formal agenda. And they had another go this year, so it's the prerogative of all parties to the Paris Agreement to propose issues that should be added to the agenda ahead of the meeting. And they did that again. It wasn't added to the agenda, but it was taken up by the Brazilian presidency with a basket of kind of big ticket items that various groups had put forward. And it then ultimately became part of the kind of key outcome, the key decision document that came out of COP30, which is called the Global Mutirão, which is after this kind of Portuguese indigenous word meaning kind of collective efforts. And so the Brazilian presidency used that device, if you like, to wrap up unilateral trade measures. They basically agreed on that to have a series of dialogues over the next couple of years to talk about the issue. And then they wrapped that in with other really sort of big and contentious topics. So one was about kind of ambition and collective efforts towards 1.5 degrees. And that had been put forward by the small island states, but with strong backing from the likes of the EU. And then the other thing that a similar group of developing countries wanted to put forward was in relation to the provision of climate finance by developed countries. And yeah, so those things were all kind of wrapped together in this sort of omnibus decision.
So Simon, would change tack a little bit maybe and start going through the various topics before I go out to the audience and kind of
Sure,
remind
yeah.
you, please to put in your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom and to tag us at IIEA in the social media. The first one I suppose to start on, you've covered a little bit already on this one, Simon, is a question about mitigation. And in the cycle of the returns of the nationally determined contributions per the Paris Agreement, this was an important part of that cycle. And the returns that came in from the various countries revealed, like you said, about the we may be coming down the far side of the curve in the near future. Something like 12% emissions reductions over 2019 would be the sum total according to the synthesis report. But I just want to go through that a little bit with you about the process, the substance of returns, the revision of the synthesis reports, and the question about the overshoot, and also the question about the efficacy of the Paris Agreement itself. Because before any of this happened, we were all heading towards a 4 degree world, whereas now we might be heading towards a 2.5 degree world by 2100. So just to go through the topic of mitigation, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you've already given a pretty good summary, but effectively, I mean, so we had all of these NDCs coming in, before and during the COP, and the UN climate body did an update of their synthesis report, which effectively tried to kind of aggregate all of those pledges and ask what if all of these pledges are met, where does that get us? And as you said, they estimated it would cut global emissions to 12% below 2019 levels, 12 or 15%, I forget exactly, by 2035. And yeah, I think in contrast, if you're looking at kind of global least cost pathways to 1.5 degrees, you'd be looking at more like a 60% reduction by that date. But on the other hand, and Simon Steele, the UN climate chief, put out a chart illustrating this very clearly. As you said, before Paris, we had been heading for 3.5 or 4 degrees of warming, based on the policies in place at that time. And now, although we're far from being on track to 1.5 degrees, we're no longer heading to that level of warming, and it's probably closer to 2.5. And yeah, so I mean, I suppose the summary is, in a way, that those new pledges do take us forward, and the question is how much, and is it enough? I mean, and it's not much and not enough is the short version of it. But I suppose what's interesting as well is that it's this key moment in the Paris cycle, and yet the topic of mitigation and talking about those NDCs and what they add up to wasn't on the formal agenda at the COP. And that essentially is why the small island states, AOSIS, put forward this proposal for an agenda item specifically to talk about NDCs and how we're getting on. And that, again, as with trade measures, that wasn't added to the agenda, but it was kind of taken up within that kind of wider presidency consultations, and ultimately in the kind of global Montreal decision. In terms of what they actually agreed to do on that, I mean, I mentioned what they did on trade measures. On mitigation, what they agreed to do was to have something called the Global Implementation Accelerator, which, as far as I can tell, is pretty ill-defined. People don't seem to know what it means, but it will be a sort of a presidency-led process. So it will be outside of the kind of formal COP process. But it's supposed to be about sort of enabling countries to accelerate their level of ambition, mitigation action, and to accelerate their action on adaptation as well. So there's that. There's also a so-called Belém Mission 1.5. People might remember there was a Mission 1.5 that came out of COP28 in Dubai. And honestly, I'm not sure what that resulted in. I'm not sure what that produced. And so I think there's similarly a lot of uncertainty and doubtfulness around whether either of those initiatives led by the presidency will amount to much. One thing that really popped up, particularly in and I think you might have a question on this later, but there was this idea of, given that in Dubai, the global stocktake outcome, there was a sort of a global agreement towards transitioning away from fossil fuels, but no real kind of concrete idea of what that would mean or how it would be done. So there were a lot of countries putting forward the idea that there should be that we should draw up a roadmap, effectively like a kind of how do we actually get there? What do we need to do to make that happen? And again, that wasn't agreed. They couldn't agree to make that part of the formal outcome at COP30. But the presidency, the Brazilian presidency, is taking that up independently, and we'll have to wait and see what they produce on that front.
Yeah, I think that will be very interesting in how those roadmaps under the GIA, the Global Implementation Accelerator. I think I'm right in saying, Simon. Yeah, and there's two sort of ideas of roadmaps there that came out. One was the transitioning on fossil fuel. And I think I'm right in saying there's going to be a meeting organized by Colombia and the Netherlands in the future to see how to progress that. Be interested to have your take on that, and also to progress a roadmap on the tropical forests. And
this podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.